I want to reflect for a few minutes on the development of media, digital media, over the last 40 years since I've been involved with it. There's been a huge expansion, everyone knows that. 1973, roughly, when I started, it was almost non-existent. I mean, computers were very, very basic, and there was no internet and no web, no Apple Mac, and so on and so on. So in the 40 years since then, there has been growing power potential for digital media. Moore's law predicts that communications media like computers double their power every 18 months, and therefore it's an exponential growth. And even in the last 8-10 years, the world has been transformed. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, the internet generally has developed amazingly in those 10 years, and it was beginning to happen in the 90s. And I've lived through that revolution in Cambridge, experimenting in various ways, and it's probably a good time now as I retire and look at the past to see what I've learned. So the first point to make is that there is vast potential. Before, when I started, all you could do was to write a book, write articles, give some lectures, reach dozens of people, perhaps hundreds if you wrote a popular book, and that was about it. You couldn't imagine that your work would really travel to India, China, Japan, South America very easily at all, nor would it really travel outside a small group of people who'd been educated up to university level, probably in England or America and perhaps on the continent. Now you can put up materials either in digital stores or on things like YouTube, which will potentially reach anyone who's interested. People right outside the academic world, right outside Europe and America. And you can also put up material which is of a different kind, not just the written word or even the particular style of academic lecturing in a university, but multimedia, databases, original documents, vast potentials for new things to be done. And you would think, therefore, that many academics and other communicators would have leapt at this kind of technology and would all be busily making films and putting up databases and so on. But on a sort of random and very small sample of thinking about my friends in academic disciplines in Cambridge and in England and the West, very, very few of them do anything much. Few have websites. They may have a web presence, but not a website really. Very few put up material onto anything other than perhaps Facebook, certainly not onto YouTube, except for one or two odd lectures and things. So only 1% of the potential of this new communications and storage media is being used. And one therefore wonders why it is so difficult. And as I've found it difficult in many ways, but overcome some of the difficulties, perhaps my experience of what I've done may be useful for other people as well. Let me start with the relatively simpler side, which is the technology. Until about 15 years ago, it was really difficult to put up, to collect and to digitize and to put up onto the web materials as an academic or anyone else. Firstly, the data capture technology, that is the cameras, the tape recorders, the computers, and those sorts of things were very primitive. I mean, it's difficult to imagine, but basically the capturing had to be done by what are known as analog media. In other words, one either wrote, one typed with an old-fashioned typewriter, or one filmed and tape recorded. And all these were cumbersome, expensive, difficult to change, to edit, and so on. So that it was really difficult to do anything much more than what we were doing, which was to type out draft after draft of articles and books and give lectures, seminars to small groups of people. What has obviously happened in the last 15 years is that this has been revolutionized by the development of communications technology, and particularly digital cameras and digital computers, digital storage devices and so on. So that 15 years ago, really, I started to play with digital cameras, to use firewire to transfer material, to use and find large storage devices so that one could actually film or collect together one's writings and very easily make these available. The cost came down, the power increased immensely, things like compression, decompression algorithms were written, new edit suites were produced by all sorts of people like Apple and so on. So really, in a shorthand, I, rather favouring them, call it the Apple Revolution. Basically all sorts of new ways of bringing together technologies and media made things which were quite unimaginable 20 years ago. If one had thought of what one's doing now in 1992, it would have just been beyond one's dreams. The internet was just beginning to be a possibility then, but that wasn't present. And of course, the internet is the other thing. The availability of something where one can reach audiences all over the world. Even broadband is quite recent in many parts of the world. In other words, things which will carry large sets of films and other media around the world is only 10, 15 years. And so all sorts of new potentials. The fact that it's become cheaper, that it's much, much easier to use. The old editing facilities, for example, were really very difficult, but they're now very simple. The digital cameras make filming much, much easier. You can film in low light, you can have excellent sound, and so on and so on. So basically the technological revolution, which makes it possible to do new things, has changed and transformed in my lifetime, and particularly in the second half of those 40 years in which I've been involved. The first 20 years were important, but they were only the foundations, and it's in the last 20 or even 10 years that everything has changed and become possible. So this has opened the door, as with all technologies, but whether one goes through that door is an entirely different matter, and that's the more difficult thing to understand and explain. Before I do explain it, perhaps I should have touched on one thing, which is storage. I did mention digital storage, hard disks off one's computer, but the presence now of digital stores in the so-called cloud, in other words, universities, libraries, YouTube and other organizations which Google, which have vast storage potentials and will hold one's material. Particularly, I'm interested in the ones related to universities like DSpace or Digital Space in Cambridge and in the facilities in the British Library and so on. Those suddenly make it possible not just to hold something on one's own computer and hopefully send it off to someone, but to hold it in a place where people can reach it as if they were going to a library. And that again has transformed things enormously. The more complicated, more anthropological, sociological, philosophical aspect of all this, of course, is once the door is opened by technology, what prevents a person going through? Throughout history, new technologies have emerged, and some of them have been taken up and some have been dropped. And it's usually quite a long process. In fact, given that many of these technologies are only 15, 20 years old, there has been immense strides and development. But academics on the whole have been a little wary and have continued to do what they've always done. There are a number of reasons for this, which I've felt in my own experience. One is the incentive structure. Basically, one communicates, one writes, one makes films or whatever it is, for a number of reasons. One is obviously to do with one's job. If one is paid to lecture and to teach students and to produce books for research exercises or whatever, one does that. And one's career depends on doing that reasonably and successfully, and one's self-satisfaction as well. One gets one's pleasure from the feedback from students, from colleagues, from face-to-face contacts. One doesn't get much pleasure from knowing that 10,000 people in India have looked at a film, but one gets huge pleasure from one or two students saying they've really enjoyed your lecture. So there's that aspect of it, plus the career promotion aspect, which is that most academics, having been trained like I was in an era when you got your promotions through your research and your publications, knew that if they produced a book or an article which was highly regarded and peer-reviewed and so on, they might well be promoted or encouraged or esteemed. Whereas I found in my last research assessment exercise in England that, which was a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, that the fact that I had a big website with many 50, 60, 70 people looking at it every day, and lots of films and other material on it, counted really for nothing. Now that is all changing. The government and other people are aware of the need to reach wider audiences, to have some public engagement and impact of a different kind. And therefore this will change, the incentive structure will change. But it's only just beginning to happen. Among the difficulties, of course, is that it's very difficult for those who are assessing research and one's teaching and so on, really to judge. It was fairly possible to read a colleague's book and to decide whether it was a good book and to see how many people were reading it and so on. It's very difficult to do that with the web and what's on the web. So a new generation has to be trained to assess these things, as well as the mentality of those of us who are trained in that world has to change. There's another set of difficulties concerned with one's training, which is that it's very difficult to shift from a kind of lonely, single model of work, particularly in the arts, humanities and social sciences. We were taught throughout our schooling and through our PhD and so on, that what you did was you went off and you sat and you gathered things from libraries and elsewhere, you wrote a book, you wrote some articles, and you published it. It was a sort of single adventure, and you didn't really do it with friends. Friends might read your stuff, but it was really a kind of prima donna, single person doing this. The idea of sharing the work and sharing the results in a different way wasn't what we were taught to do. So that basically you have to relearn. And one of the great difficulties you come across with this is that we were like craftsmen. We produced a valuable object as we thought it, an article or a book or whatever. It was ours, we had intellectual property in it, it was esteemed, it was our assets, our resources for our job and so on. Now the idea that you just put this material that you've gathered out for others to use runs against a whole centuries of tradition of intellectual property, intellectual copyright. The idea that this is yours, the idea that people could just take this down, use it themselves, absorb it into their worlds without you even knowing. There was some element of this in books, but there were all sorts of safeguards. It's now a world where you have far less control if you start putting material up onto the cloud than you had before, and therefore you feel apprehensive that people will steal your ideas, that you won't get any credit for them and so on. So that's a big problem. Another problem is to do with the boundaries between the private and the public. Irving Goffman talks about the backstage and the front stage. The front stage is where you do things in public, where you lecture, where you put out your books, and so on, if you're an academic, and your films. The backstage is where you live your private life, which of course also includes writing the books and making the films. But there has always been a big gap between these, traditionally. And the web now breaks that down. It makes everything open, front stage, or at least it can potentially. And if you've been brought up in an era where your life was rather private most of the time, even semi-private, for example in a lecture hall, you gave a lecture to people, you knew who they were, you could see them, and even with writing a book you could roughly estimate who the audience for the book would be. It would be quite small and it would be people like yourself and your students. Suddenly to bring all the stages up from the back to the front, to make it possible for people to see you in your earlier phases, see the background to your work, the drafts of your work, your muddles, your confusions, and even to see your lectures, which some people would find embarrassing if they felt they weren't very good lecturers. All that sets up other inhibitions to producing material which will go up onto the web. And then there's another set of considerations, which are the ethical ones. Previously, academics, particularly when they did their research, and particularly if they did research on human subjects, as in anthropology or psychology or sociology, and even to a certain extent with recent historical work, were dealing with people who might not be worried or even aware if material about them was contained in a PhD or even given out in a lecture to a small audience. But if it suddenly becomes available to their friends and their colleagues and the whole world, because it's put up onto a digital store in some form, anyone can access it, that's a whole new set of problems. Because particularly if you're filming, but even if you're writing, you gather all sorts of confidential information, obviously. You can't always be aware of what is confidential, particularly if you're working in another culture. You don't know what will be disturbing and upsetting. And therefore, if you put up that film, make it available, put up your field notes, put up your family history, put up your family photographs and archives onto digital media, and make it available to the world, who knows what explosions there might be. It's an absolute minefield. And this is exactly what I thought when I started. When I started tinkering, in other words, when I started to put up material about the field work I was doing in the Himalayas, the travels I went to in Japan or India, the family materials, bits about my own life, even my lectures, and so on. I felt at first when I put it on my own website, at least it'll probably be only other academics who look at my website. As I gradually realised that it was much beyond that, and as I put up material on things like YouTube or the streaming media service in Cambridge University or whatever, I realised that this could potentially be very, very damaging. I might hurt people, I might get acrimonious remarks and comments, and I waited with some apprehension. Obviously I started very slowly and gingerly. The surprise really is that you get, at least I've got so far, it may change, very little negative feedback. I think even with YouTube, I think only about 1 in 50 of the comments I get on my 800 odd films on YouTube are negative, and the messages I get through emails on my website and so on are mostly very supportive and interested, and thank you for doing this and so on and so on. Occasionally, once or twice, I've had to take things off, but I have hardly ever had any comments from people in Nepal or elsewhere saying, "I wish you hadn't done that." That may be comforting, and I may just have been lucky. And certainly one has got to think about this carefully. It's obvious that one gathers, as an academic, many things, and there are many things about one's own family and one's own private life which should not be made available. Either they shouldn't be made available except to a few people who will know how to handle them, and so one puts them on restricted access, or they shouldn't be made available except for 2 or 3 generations in the future. In the interests of history, there are a number of confidential things which should be kept, but they shouldn't be available to damage people in the present. So one has got to think about this all the time. The ethics of this is very important. And yet, for those who are contemplating this kind of activity, it's really worth saying in an encouraging way that the philosophy which I think the British Library has developed, and I've also developed, which is be daring, be careful, but be daring, put up things, and if there is a problem of either copyright, ethics, privacy, whatever, then take them down. But don't be too inhibited and think of all the problems that might emerge from anything, because if you start thinking about those too much, nothing would ever go up. Everything is potentially dangerous. And yet there is also so much on the web, so much available, and on the whole, people seem to treat it in a charitable, understanding way, which has impressed me. As human beings, as academics, as anyone, we have to choose what we want to spend our time on. Many of my colleagues and I myself, when faced with the scarce resources of time and money, whether to write a book, an article, to teach, to travel, spend time with our families, or to put up material either as digital preservation archives or as teaching communication materials, would choose other things. And that's particularly the case because it does take time and energy to make databases, to make films, to put up materials. How does one overcome the difficulties here? Well, just 1 or 2 things from my own experience. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, most academic work is rather in the social sciences and humanities is individualistic. And in order to create worthwhile, larger projects, one really needs to work with people. And I found that one of the pleasures of my life has been working with colleagues, with either small groups, 2, 3, 4 people who have different skills. And the projects I'll be talking about later in these films are based mainly on small group research projects, or even just with 1 or 2 people. My work in Japan or in China or in Nepal or elsewhere is usually done intensively with 1 or 2 people. The hard work of data input, analysis, and so on requires a lot of time and energy, which many academics don't really have. They have the time to write up the results, but not to do the 99% of perspiration work which goes behind academic work, or not much of that. I have been enormously fortunate in having in Sarah Harrison, my research assistant, colleague, wife, someone who does a lot of that work. But it's also been done with other colleagues over the years. And therefore, I think the important thing is to try and develop that skill, which is much more widespread in the sciences, of group work. It's difficult again in the arts and humanities, because how do you allocate the rewards and the promotion earning results of your work and so on, which are better worked out in the sciences. But it is really important to realize that this multimedia, modern communications work really requires a set of skills which is unlikely that one individual is going to have all the time one individual is going to have. There's also the practical problem of finances. I've again been enormously fortunate in having both institutional funding from Cambridge bodies like King's College or the university, from research councils like the Economic and Social Research Council, the Leverhulme, Nuffield, and so on, but also particularly from private foundations and individuals like Jerry Martin and the Renaissance Trust, George Appel and the Firebird Foundation, who have believed in my work and who have over the years given me just that extra amount of funding. That was terribly important in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and made all the difference. Now, at least, I think the problem is just a little less problematic, in that it looks as if a lot of the technology is becoming cheaper and easier to use, and therefore the overheads are not as great as in those days. So there are resources. People can apply for grants to all sorts of places, and this kind of work is of interest to research councils and bodies, and it doesn't require a huge amount. The equipment, as I said, has got cheaper, the storage is much cheaper, so it is possible to do things which before really needed big institutional support. The main cost, of course, is one's own time and one's friends and colleagues' time, and therefore the extra cost of equipment and travel and so on is not so great. So it is possible, but it also depends to a certain extent on luck. The final question is to do with why one does all this. Clearly, many people are not interested. Firstly, they're not interested in preserving materials. I happen to be very, very keen and have always been interested, perhaps partly as a historian, partly as a result of my family and their history and my upbringing. I've been interested in preserving as much as possible, both of my own life and other people's lives. And as a result, from the age of about 16, 17, I've kept a huge amount of material, and I hate to see things disappearing. So a lot of my work has been trying to preserve both family records, but also other cultures, disappearing cultures in Nepal or disappearing cultures in China, India, wherever it happens to be, and other people's materials and other people's lives, as I'll explain. So basically, I want to save. I don't want to just save for myself. I don't just want to save for my students. I don't just want to save for my own lifetime, but forever. I've got a real desire to lay down what people often call time capsules, all sorts of little time capsules of my own life, other people's lives, of people I encounter, and so on. So that desire to preserve and save is very, very strong in me, and many people don't have it at all, so that's fine. They don't have to put this material up. There's a second desire which I've always seemed to have had, which I don't know how one would explain it, but basically I want to break down the barriers between my head and my heart, my life and my work, and the private and the public. I've been very prepared, in a way that many English in particular and others aren't, to share my private side with my public side, to draw on my own life and my experiences. And in this kind of medium, that is quite an important attribute or character trait, as I have mentioned, because exposing oneself in public, one's own ideas, one's own materials, one's own inadequacies, is not easy. It requires a certain character and certain self-confidence and a certain experience of doing it over the years and not finding anything too awful happened. Obviously, the experience of having to learn to lecture, to teach, to communicate since I was a small child has given me the strength and skills to a certain extent to do this. But you also have to want to do it and to take these risks and to share with the world and to communicate. Another thing which is helpful is an interest in technology. I've lectured on technology, I've experimented with technology. I'm intrigued by how it works. I'm not very practical, I don't make things, I was never much good at anything in the way of making, but I'm interested in films and computers and how they work, and to a certain extent, and particularly in what their potentials are. And many people aren't, they just hate gadgets, they're frightened by them. I had the good fortune of getting involved with cameras and computers in the very early days when they were really possible to understand roughly what was happening to a certain extent. Now they're of course so sophisticated you can't get inside them, but that gave me the confidence to realize that they are really not very frightening. So I've had many years, dozens of different computers and very many different cameras and so on, and watched these things evolve and been interested in them and lectured about it and taught about it. So that's another feature. Then there's also a feature which is to do with imagination. All new technologies emerge in answer to certain needs or out of curiosity, and for a long time it's difficult to see what exactly you could use for them. It was a famous sort of joke about the Japanese. They invented all sorts of technologies and then someone else had to think of what use they could be. To a certain extent that's always the case. We live from our experience of the past. I was taught and brought up in an age of the book, and to imagine an age of the internet is difficult for my generation and even for young people, because you're trying to imagine things in the future which haven't yet occurred. They will occur if we imagine them. They won't occur if we don't imagine them. So basically, throughout my life, what I've tried to do is to think, well, suppose we took this tendency on for another 20, 30 years, what would it be like? And let us start preparing for that. Let's have a 30-year plan. Now, if you had a 30-year plan now, you looked at what has happened in the last 10 years, or even 20 years, it's just mind-boggling. The development of the speed of computers and the internet and all the rest of it over the last 10 years, if you double that again in the next 10 years, it's just extraordinary. Just to take a tiny example, when I first went to the Himalayas in 1968, you went to a remote village without electricity, with schools with hardly anything in them, and children basically working on the land and so on, high up in the Annapurna Mountains. One can imagine in 5-10 years' time in that same village, and it's halfway there. They already, in the last 2 or 3 years, have had satellite television. There are 2 or 3 mobile phones per inhabitant of the per family in the village. They have a road going up to the village, and there are plans for every school in Nepal, these remote mountain village schools in a very poor country, to have satellite dishes, so that every school will have access to the internet, fast broadband. That would mean that all the resources, all the books that are being put up onto the internet, all the films, every educational set of materials in the world and other materials will be available to young children in this remote village. Now that, if you'd said that to me even 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago, I'd have thought you were absolutely crazy. Now if that's happened, what's going to happen in the next 40 years or even 10 years? And that's what we have to imagine. And that's why it's so exciting, and it's also why I would like to just talk about what's happened in my lifetime and encourage those who are interested in doing things into the future to use their imagination and to relax and to experiment and to use these marvelous new tools, but at the same time think about the ethics. Thanks.